A pregnant German shepherd stumbled through a violent mountain rainstorm and stopped before an old cabin hidden deep in the Blue Ridge Mountains. Her black and tan coat was soaked. Her legs trembled beneath the weight of exhaustion, and every breath came hard as thunder rolled above the pines. She pressed one muddy paw against the wooden door, carrying two unborn lives she could no longer protect alone. Inside, Jack Miller, a retired Navy SEAL, sat in the dim glow of a dying fire, haunted by the wife he had lost, the daughter he had pushed away, and a grief no war had ever prepared him to survive. But when he opened that door and saw Bella's steady, pleading eyes, something inside him, something he thought had been buried forever, began to wake. What happened next, in the heart of that storm, would become more than a rescue. It would become a miracle of mercy, proving that sometimes God sends hope on four tired paws, and that even the most broken soul can find its way back home. Before we continue, tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and subscribe if you believe God can send miracles in the most unexpected ways. Rain came down over the Blue Ridge Mountains like the sky had split open, flooding the black pines, rattling the cabin roof, and turning every narrow trail into a ribbon of mud. Jack Miller sat alone inside the old wooden cabin, listening to the storm hammer against the walls as if the whole mountain wanted to be let in. He was 47 years old, tall and broad-shouldered, with the stillness of a man who had once been trained to move only when movement mattered. His dark brown hair was cut short out of habit, though gray had begun to gather at his temples like frost. A square jaw, a straight nose, and calm blue-gray eyes gave him the hard, carved look of a soldier, but the tired shadows beneath those eyes told a quieter truth. Jack had survived wars, broken bones, enemy fire, and nights when death had breathed close enough to fog his skin. Yet the one thing he had never learned to survive properly was the absence of his wife. Sarah Miller had been the kind of woman people remembered without trying. She had been slender and graceful, with warm, fair skin, auburn hair that curled wildly in damp weather, and soft hazel eyes that could turn Jack's silence into something less frightening. She was not loud, but she filled rooms. She taught school in the small town below the ridge, baked bread badly, but laughed beautifully about it, and believed every wounded thing deserved at least one open door. 3 summers ago, a sudden highway accident took her away before Jack could say goodbye. After that, something inside him folded inward. He sold the house, ignored old friends, and moved up into the cabin where no one asked him how he was doing. Even Emma, his daughter, became a voice he could not answer. Emma Miller was 26 now, tall like her father but finer boned, with dark blonde hair, sharp blue-gray eyes, and the guarded expression of someone who had learned that grief could make parents disappear while they were still alive. She had called at first, then emailed, then stopped trying so often. Jack told himself she was better off without a father who had become a locked room. It was the kind of lie that kept a man alive while slowly starving him. That night the cabin smelled of wet pine, old smoke, and black coffee gone cold. The fire in the stone hearth burned low, throwing restless orange light across the walls. Jack sat in a worn armchair with a blanket over one knee, though he was not really cold. The cold he carried had nothing to do with weather. It lived deeper, beneath memory, beneath muscle, in the place where Sarah's laughter used to be. Thunder rolled over the ridge. The windows shivered. Jack closed his eyes, and for a moment he saw Sarah standing by the door years ago, smiling at a stray cat she had coaxed inside during another storm. "Mercy doesn't wait for perfect timing," she had told him then, holding the shivering animal against her sweater. "It usually shows up wet, inconvenient, and hungry." Jack almost smiled at the memory, but the expression died before it could reach his mouth. Then came the sound. Not thunder, not a branch. A soft scrape at the front door, followed by one weak knock. Jack opened his eyes. His body went still in that old military way, every sense sharpening. The rain beat harder. He waited. Another sound came, lower this time, almost swallowed by the storm, a trembling whine. No one came this far up the ridge at night. No hiker would survive the mudslides forming below the trail. Jack reached for the flashlight on the table and stood slowly, his knees stiff, his heart suddenly louder than the rain. As he crossed the room, some buried part of him wanted to stop. The door had become more than wood and hinges over the years. It was the line between the pain he knew and the world that might ask something of him again. He placed one hand on the latch. For a second he thought of Sarah. Then he opened it. Wind and rain burst into the cabin, sharp and wild. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness and landed on a German shepherd standing on the porch. She was young, perhaps 3 years old, black and tan beneath the mud, her thick coat plastered to her body, her amber eyes bright with exhaustion. She was heavily pregnant, her belly low and tight, her sides shuddering with each breath. One ear stood alert while the other bent slightly under the weight of rain. She was strong-boned and beautiful in the way working dogs are beautiful, not delicate, but loyal-looking, built for endurance and love. Yet now her legs trembled so badly she could barely remain standing. She lifted one paw as if to knock again, then swayed. Jack felt his chest tighten. The dog did not look wild. She looked at him as though she had chosen him, as though every flooded path and bolt of lightning had led her to this one door. Her eyes held no accusation, only a desperate, steady plea. Jack knelt slowly, rain soaking through his shirt. The dog's nose brushed his hand, warm despite the storm. Beneath her soaked fur, another contraction rippled through her body. Jack understood then. She was not only asking for shelter, she was asking for a chance. Behind him, the cabin glowed with firelight. Before him, the storm roared like an old god demanding that every living thing surrender. Jack swallowed hard, feeling the weight of years press against his ribs. He could close the door and remain the man grief had made. Or he could step back and become responsible for something alive again. His voice came out rough, almost unused. "Easy, girl," he whispered. "Come in." He opened the door wider, and as the German shepherd crossed the threshold, dripping rain and fear onto the wooden floor, Jack knew the mountain had not sent him a visitor. It had sent him a choice. Jack Miller shut the cabin door with his shoulder, sealing out the roaring rain, but not the feeling that the storm had followed him inside. Water streamed from Bella's coat onto the wooden floor, gathering in dark puddles around her trembling paws. The German shepherd stood just past the threshold, head lowered, amber eyes fixed on him with a steadiness that was almost human. She was large for a female, built with the clean strength of a working dog, her black saddle darkened by rain, tan legs shaking from exhaustion, her belly swollen and tight beneath soaked fur. There was no wildness in her, no snapping panic, only a painful discipline, as if she understood that fear would waste the last strength she had. Jack saw that immediately. Men in combat had looked like that before, not calm because they were safe, but calm because breaking down was a luxury they could not afford. "Easy," he murmured, though his own voice sounded rough and foreign in the room. "We'll figure this out." The word "we" landed, strangely, in the cabin. For years, it had been a place of I. I wake, I breathe, I drink bitter coffee, I keep the fire alive, I do not answer the phone. Now the room held another heartbeat, and perhaps more than one. Bella took one step toward the hearth, then stopped as a contraction tightened through her body. Her ribs flared, her jaw clenched, and a low sound rose from her chest. Not a cry, not yet, but the deep, restrained groan of a creature trying to carry pain with dignity. Jack moved before thought could catch him. He crossed to the fireplace, shoved 2 split logs onto the coals, and coaxed the flame higher until orange light climbed the stone and pushed warmth back into the room. The only lamp he trusted during storms was an old brass oil lamp Sarah had loved, dented near the base and polished unevenly by her hands. He lit it with fingers that had steadied rifles, bandaged wounds, and once held Sarah's face on mornings when she laughed at his terrible coffee. The lamp's glow spread softly across the cabin, gentler than the fire, turning the rain-streaked windows into black mirrors. Jack dragged an old wool blanket from the cedar chest, the one Sarah had folded years ago with lavender tucked between its layers. The scent had faded, but not completely. It rose when he shook the blanket out, and for one sharp second grief opened its mouth inside him. He almost stopped. Then Bella swayed again, and grief had to wait. He laid the blanket near the hearth, not too close to the sparks, and crouched beside her, keeping his movements slow. "Here," he said. "This is better." Bella stared at the blanket, then at him. Trust, Jack knew, was not a thing given freely by animals who had been failed by the world. It was measured, tested, offered in inches. At last she stepped onto the wool and lowered herself with terrible care, one leg folding, then the other, her belly shifting heavily as she settled on her side. Another contraction came almost at once. This one was stronger. Her body bowed around it, and Jack felt an old, precise part of his mind awaken. Assess, prepare, do only what helps. He had never delivered puppies in a cabin during a mountain storm, but he had worked under pressure. He had learned the language of blood, breath, shock, warmth. He fetched clean towels from the shelf. Boiled water he did not truly need but wanted ready, washed his hands until they were red, and placed a shallow bowl near Bella's head. Outside, thunder cracked so hard the windows rattled in their frames. Inside, Jack knelt beside a laboring dog and tried not to let his hands shake. "Sarah," he whispered once, not asking for a miracle exactly, but perhaps for instruction. Sarah Miller had been slender and bright-eyed, with auburn curls that escaped every clip she used, a small scar on one thumb from a kitchen knife, and a stubborn mercy that had once annoyed him because it made no tactical sense. She had believed tenderness was a form of courage. Jack had believed courage meant taking fire without blinking. Now, watching Bella pant through another wave of pain, he wondered if Sarah had understood war better than he ever had. The first puppy came after a stretch of time that seemed both endless and violently brief. Bella strained, her paws scraping against the blanket, her ears pinned back as rain lashed the cabin roof. Jack held himself still until movement mattered. Then a small, slick body appeared, dark and fragile, folded into itself as if reluctant to enter a world so loud. For half a breath, nothing happened. The cabin seemed to hold its air. Jack's training surged through him. He cleared the membrane from the tiny face with the edge of a towel, rubbed the little body firmly but gently, and leaned close, his own breath caught somewhere between fear and prayer. The puppy twitched. Once, then again. A thin squeak escaped it, so small that thunder nearly swallowed it whole. Jack laughed then, a broken, startled sound that cracked out of him before he could bury it. Bella lifted her head, exhausted but alert, and began licking the pup with slow, determined strokes. The little male was dark, almost black along the back, with faint tan markings on his tiny paws and muzzle. He moved more than Jack expected, pushing blindly against the towel, stubborn as a spark in wet wood. "Lucky," Jack said before he had time to question the name. It was too simple, maybe too sentimental, but it felt true. Lucky to reach the porch. Lucky Jack had opened the door. Lucky to make that first impossible sound beneath an oil lamp while the mountain tried to drown everything outside. Bella pulled the puppy close, curling her body around him, but her rest lasted only moments. Another contraction seized her, sharper and lower. Jack saw the change in her eyes. The second birth was coming faster, and this one was harder. Bella's strength had already been spent on the storm, the climb, the first small life now pressed against her belly. Jack placed one hand near her shoulder, not restraining, only grounding. "Stay with me, girl," he said quietly. "You're doing the hard part. I'm just the fool with towels." It was the first joke he had made aloud in months, and even Bella seemed unimpressed, which was fair. The second puppy emerged smaller than the first, pale tan along the muzzle with a white mark no bigger than a raindrop beneath the chin. She did not move at once. Jack's humor vanished. He worked quickly, clearing her face, rubbing her chest, changing towels when the first grew cold. "Come on," he whispered, then firmer, as if giving an order to the universe. "Come on." Nothing. The fire popped. Bella whined, lifting her head weakly. Jack felt something old and savage twist in him, the helplessness he hated more than danger. He rubbed harder, careful not to harm the tiny ribs. Then the little female's mouth opened and a thread of breath entered her. Her chest fluttered, uncertain, then rose again. Jack bowed his head for 1 second, eyes burning. "Daisy," he said, because she looked too delicate for the storm that had delivered her and too stubborn to be dismissed by it. Bella drew Daisy close beside Lucky, licking them both as if counting them by touch. Jack sat back on his heels, drenched in rainwater, sweat, and something like awe. His hands were shaking now, openly. These were hands that had held weapons steady under night skies, hands that had dragged wounded men through smoke, hands that had failed to keep Sarah in the world. And yet tonight, beneath a dented oil lamp in a leaking cabin, those same hands had helped 2 lives begin. He looked around the room as if seeing it after a long absence. The cracked table, the old chair, Sarah's lamp, the fire climbing stronger, Bella's breathing slowing, Lucky nosing blindly for warmth. Daisy tucked against her brother, small but present, choosing life 1 breath at a time. The cabin had not become happy. Not yet. Happiness was too loud a word for this fragile hour, but it was no longer empty. It held need, and because it held need, it held purpose. Jack rose slowly, fetched fresh water, and placed it where Bella could reach without moving far. She drank in careful laps, never taking her eyes from the puppies for long. When she looked back at Jack, the plea in her gaze had changed. It was still tired, still guarded, but beneath it lay recognition. He nodded once, soldier to mother, broken man to brave creature. "You did good, Bella," he said. Then, after a pause, softer, "All 3 of you did." Outside, the rain kept beating against the roof, but inside the oil lamp burned on, and for the first time in years, Jack Miller listened to more than memory. He listened to Bella's breath, Lucky's restless squeaks, Daisy's fragile sighs, and the strange, frightening sound of his own heart beginning to answer. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving the Blue Ridge Mountains washed in silver mist, the trees dripping steadily as if the whole forest were waking from a fever. Jack Miller woke on the floor beside the hearth with his back against the armchair, 1 boot still on, the other lying near a puddle he had forgotten to clean. For 1 confused second, he listened for the old silence, the hollow kind that used to fill the cabin after every storm, thick as dust and twice as patient. Instead, he heard breathing. Bella's breath came first, deep and tired, a slow rise and fall from the blanket near the fire. Then came Lucky's restless little squeaks, thin but demanding, like a tiny king issuing orders from a kingdom no larger than his mother's belly. Daisy answered with softer sounds, barely there, tucked close to Bella's chest as if she preferred to survive quietly, without making a spectacle of it. Jack opened his eyes and stared at them, and something inside him shifted before he had a name for it. The cabin had not changed overnight in any grand, magical way. The roof still leaked near the back window. The sink still groaned when the pump caught air. The kitchen table still had 1 leg shorter than the others and rocked like a drunk sailor whenever he set a mug on it. But the room felt different. It had witnesses now. It had needs. It had 3 living creatures who did not care that Jack was broken, decorated, retired, grieving, stubborn, or very bad at remembering where he kept clean towels. They simply needed warmth, food, water, and someone willing to stay. He rose carefully, every joint complaining from sleeping wrong, and Bella lifted her head. She looked better than she had the night before, though exhaustion still lay heavy over her body. Her coat had begun to dry, revealing the proud black saddle across her back and the rich tan fur along her legs and face. Her amber eyes followed Jack with quiet caution, not fear, but assessment. She was a mother now, and the cabin was not truly his anymore. It belonged partly to her vigilance. Jack respected that. "Morning," he said, then paused, embarrassed by the sound of his own voice. Or, whatever counts as morning after you three turned my house into a maternity ward. Lucky squirmed blindly against Bella's stomach as though offended by the joke. Daisy remained still, pressed under her mother's chin, accepting the world with the grave patience of a tiny monk. Jack cleaned first. Not because he had become a new man before breakfast, but because the floor was a battlefield of muddy paw prints, wet blankets, cold towels, ash, and rainwater. He moved with slow, practical care, wringing out cloths, wiping boards, dragging the soaked rug toward the porch and hanging it over the railing where it sagged like a defeated animal. Outside, the air smelled of wet pine, mud, and crushed leaves. The narrow trail below the cabin had become a brown scar running down the ridge. Somewhere far off, a creek roared louder than usual, swollen by the storm. Jack noted it automatically, the way he noted everything that might become a problem later. Then Lucky squeaked again, and the creek had to wait. He returned to the hearth, warmed a small pot of water, and prepared food for Bella from what he had: boiled chicken, rice, and the last of a broth he had once bought during a flu he pretended was not a flu. He set the bowl near her, close enough that she would not have to stand. Bella sniffed it, looked at him, then ate with slow hunger, never fully taking her eyes off Lucky and Daisy. Jack watched her and felt a reluctant admiration settle in him. She trusted nothing completely, not the fire, not the walls, not the man feeding her, and yet she had chosen to rest. That kind of courage was quieter than charging through gunfire, but not smaller. Over the next few days, the cabin began to rearrange itself around them. Jack pushed the coffee table against the wall to give Bella more room. He patched the leak above the back window with a strip of tin and enough curses to frighten away any respectable angel. He washed the old blankets twice and cut one into smaller pieces for the puppies, apologizing to Sarah under his breath because it had once been her favorite camping blanket. Sarah Miller lived in the cabin now mostly as traces. The brass oil lamp, a blue mug with a chipped handle, a stack of old paperback novels on the shelf, a faded yellow raincoat still hanging on a peg by the door. She had been a slender woman with laughing hazel eyes, fair skin that freckled in summer, and auburn hair that never obeyed weather, combs, or common sense. She had also been the only person who could make Jack feel forgiven before he had confessed anything. When he touched the yellow raincoat, dust came away on his fingers, and for once the memory did not strike like a blade. It ached, yes, but softer, as if grief had sat down beside him instead of standing in his path. Bella improved by inches. On the second day, she stood long enough to drink from the larger bowl near the kitchen. On the third, she followed Jack with her eyes instead of lifting her head every time he crossed the room. On the fourth, she let him move the blanket closer to the wall where the draft was weaker. Lucky, however, showed no respect for recovery schedules. Though his eyes were sealed and his legs were no more useful than wet twigs, he pushed, rolled, wriggled, and complained whenever the universe failed to arrange itself according to his wishes. Jack found him halfway off the blanket one afternoon, grunting with heroic determination toward absolutely nowhere. "You planning a rescue mission?" Jack asked, picking him up carefully with both hands. The puppy fit in his palms like warm bread with opinions. "Because you've got no map, no boots, and frankly, terrible strategy." Bella watched, ears raised. Jack placed Lucky back against her and she gave the pup one firm lick, the motherly equivalent of calling him an idiot with love. Daisy, by contrast, made Jack uneasy at first because she was so quiet. She nursed, slept, and pressed herself against Bella's warmth with small, deliberate movements. But each morning she was still there, breathing, steady, choosing life without drama. Jack began to understand her rhythm. Lucky fought the world. Daisy endured it. Both seemed in their ridiculous puppy way braver than he had been for years. The strangest change was not the cleaning, or the repairs, or even the tiny sounds near the fire. It was that Jack began speaking before he remembered not to. He told Bella when thunder was only thunder. He told Lucky that crawling into the firewood basket was not a career path. He told Daisy she was doing fine, even when she gave no sign of needing his opinion. The cabin, once a shrine to things unsaid, slowly filled with rough little sentences. None of them were beautiful. Some were not even complete. But they were alive. On the fifth evening, after rain returned in a gentle curtain instead of a rage, Jack noticed his laptop on the high shelf near the pantry. It sat under a thin skin of dust, closed like an accusation. For years he had avoided it because screens had a way of becoming doors, and doors had a way of letting people ask questions. He stood there a long time, one hand braced on the shelf, listening to Bella breathe behind him. Then Daisy sighed. Lucky squeaked, and Jack, irritated by the fact that puppies were apparently now moral advisors, took the laptop down. The battery was nearly dead. The cord was tangled behind old manuals, a dead flashlight, and a jar full of screws he had kept for reasons even God probably found excessive. When the screen finally came to life, its blue glow looked almost unnatural in the warm room. Messages loaded slowly through the weak mountain signal. Most were old notices, bills, weather alerts, things that had arrived and gone stale without him. Then he saw one name that made his hand freeze above the keyboard. Emma Miller. His daughter's email sat unread, sent 3 weeks earlier. Jack felt the cabin tilt inward. Emma was 26 now, though memory kept betraying him with younger versions. A little girl with dark blonde braids and grass stains on her knees. A teenager with his blue-gray eyes and Sarah's stubborn chin. A young woman at her mother's funeral standing too straight, too pale, too silent. She had grown tall like him, but where Jack's body was broad and weathered, Emma was lean, sharp-featured and careful, with a guarded mouth that rarely softened unless something caught her off guard. After Sarah died, Jack had mistaken her silence for strength because it was easier than recognizing it as abandonment reflected back at him. He opened the email. It was short. Emma wrote that she had been thinking about her mother because the summer storms always reminded her of Sarah dancing barefoot on the porch, pretending thunder was applause. She wrote that she did not know if Jack still used this address. She wrote that she hoped he was eating, sleeping, doing something besides disappearing. At the end, she asked one question. "Are you okay, Dad?" Jack stared at those 4 words until they blurred. He wanted to close the laptop. He wanted to delete the email and pretend Mercy had not arrived in another inconvenient form. But Bella shifted near the fire, drawing Lucky and Daisy closer with one tired paw, and Jack understood something that made his chest hurt. Some doors did not knock with paws, some knocked with words. His fingers hovered over the keys, unable to answer. Not yet. He did not know how to tell Emma that he was not okay, but that something had entered the cabin and made not okay feel less final. He did not know how to say he was sorry without making the word too small for the damage. So he did the only thing he could manage. He left the email open. He did not delete it. He did not close the screen. He sat beside Bella, Lucky, and Daisy, while rain whispered over the roof, and for the first time in years, Jack Miller allowed a question from the world to remain unanswered without being rejected. The fog came down late in the afternoon, soft and gray, folding itself around the Blue Ridge pines until the whole mountain seemed to be holding its breath. Jack Miller had spent most of the day pretending he was not thinking about Emma's email. He cleaned the same skillet twice, stacked firewood that was already stacked, and checked the patched leak above the back window even though the rain had stopped hours ago. The laptop remained open on the table, its screen dimmed but not dark, waiting with the patience of something that knew it had already won. Near the hearth, Bella rested on the wool blanket with Lucky and Daisy tucked against her belly. The German shepherd looked stronger now, though motherhood had sharpened her into a creature of constant attention. Her black and tan coat had dried into a thick, uneven shine, her ears lifting at every creak, every drip from the eaves, every shift of Jack's boots on the floor. Lucky had become louder by the hour, a blind little tyrant with a dark back, tan paws, and no respect for borders. Daisy remained quieter, smaller, pale around the muzzle, steady in a way that made Jack check on her more often than she probably required. "You two are bad supervisors," he muttered, while setting a fresh bowl of water near Bella. Lucky squeaked as if filing a complaint. Daisy slept through the entire hearing. Bella blinked at Jack, unimpressed but no longer suspicious in the same hard way. That, he had learned, was progress. Then came a sound from outside. Not a scratch, not a desperate knock like Bella's had been, but 3 firm taps on the porch post. Jack froze. His first instinct was old and immediate. Locate threat, count exits, control breathing. His second instinct, newer and far more irritating, was to glance at Bella as if she had suddenly become his advisor on social matters. Bella raised her head, ears forward, but did not growl. That settled him more than he cared to admit. Jack crossed to the window and parted the curtain with 2 fingers. A woman stood on the porch beneath the sagging roofline, her boots muddy, her shoulders squared against the damp air. She looked to be in her early 60s, tall and spare, with the wiry strength of someone who had lifted feed sacks, repaired fences, and argued with stubborn animals for most of her life. Her steel-gray hair was cut short beneath a faded green knit cap, and her face was narrow, weathered, and intelligent, with pale blue eyes that missed very little. She wore a brown canvas coat patched at one elbow, work gloves tucked under one arm, and a red plaid scarf wrapped tightly at her throat. This was not a lost hiker. This was a woman who had come because she meant to. Jack opened the door halfway. "Can I help you?" His voice came out flat, defensive, the voice of a man who had spent years making sure no one mistook distance for invitation. The woman looked him over without flinching. "You must be Jack Miller," she said. "I'm Linda Brooks. I live down in the hollow, past the old apple orchard. Saw your chimney smoking steady for the first time in a long while. Figured either you'd found religion, company, or trouble." Her mouth twitched. "Around here, those 3 often arrive wearing the same boots." Jack stared at her. He had not forgotten how humor worked, exactly. He had merely stopped expecting it at his door. "I'm fine," he said. Linda's eyes moved past his shoulder, and her expression changed the moment she saw Bella. Not surprise alone, but understanding. The practical kind. The kind born from years around living creatures. She said softly. "That explains the smoke." Bella watched Linda with steady caution, her head lifted, body curved around Lucky and Daisy. Linda did not push forward. She did not coo, did not reach, did not make the mistake of treating a tired mother like a decoration. Instead, she lowered her gaze slightly and stood still. "Pretty girl," she said. "Looks like she chose the one cabin with a soldier and a fireplace. Smart dog." Jack hesitated, then opened the door wider. "Don't crowd her." "Wasn't planning to," Linda replied, stepping inside carefully and wiping her boots before he could ask. "I've raised goats with worse tempers than generals and bottle-fed calves that thought my fingers were breakfast. I know a mother when I see one." She carried a canvas sack in one hand and set it on the table, not near Bella, not near the puppies. The cabin seemed to shrink and expand at the same time with another human inside it. Jack became aware of every neglected corner, every dust line, every dish he had failed to wash before grief turned housekeeping into a rumor. Linda noticed, of course. Her eyes flicked over the room. Sarah's yellow raincoat by the door, the patched roof seam, the open laptop, the blankets near the fire. But she said nothing about any of it. That silence, oddly, felt generous. Linda Brooks had been widowed 7 years earlier, though Jack only knew it from town talk he had tried not to hear. Her husband, Earl, had died of a stroke in the north pasture while mending a gate, and people said Linda had finished fixing the gate before calling anyone, not because she was cold, but because the cattle would have scattered if she had not. Since then, she ran her small farm alone. Goats, hens, 2 aging horses, and an opinion about every road in the county. She had a reputation for being blunt enough to bruise and kind enough to show up before being asked. Jack had avoided people like her for exactly that reason. Kind strangers were dangerous. They found cracks and brought soup. Linda opened the sack and began placing things on the table. a sealed bag of dog food, a tin of powdered goat's milk, clean rags folded tight, a small bottle of antiseptic, 2 soft flannel blankets, and a paper-wrapped loaf of bread still warm enough to scent the air. Jack looked at the supplies, then at her. "I didn't ask for help." "No," Linda said, unbothered. "That's why I brought it." Lucky squeaked from the blanket as if endorsing her methods. Linda glanced toward him. "Loud one, isn't he?" "That's Lucky," Jack said before he could stop himself. The name sounded strangely personal in front of another person. "The quiet one's Daisy." Linda's face softened just briefly. "You named them." Jack's jaw tightened. They needed names. Most things do. She looked at him then, not sharply, but with enough weight that he felt seen against his will. "Sarah used to say that." Jack's breath caught. "You knew Sarah?" "A little. Everybody knew Sarah a little. She made it hard not to." Linda removed her gloves slowly. She used to bring books to the church sale and buy back half of them because she felt sorry for the ones nobody picked. A memory struck Jack so suddenly he nearly laughed. Sarah carrying a box of unwanted paperbacks into their car, declaring that abandoned books had feelings. He had told her books did not have feelings. She had said that was exactly what a man with no imagination would think. Jack looked away. The grief that rose this time did not come alone. It brought warmth with it, unwelcome and familiar. Linda did not apologize for mentioning Sarah. That, too, was a mercy. She simply walked closer to the hearth, stopping several feet from Bella. "May I?" she asked Jack, but her eyes were on the dog. Bella watched her. No growl, no retreat. Jack gave a small nod. Linda crouched with visible effort, one knee cracking loudly enough to make her grimace. "Getting old is a comedy written by a cruel person," she muttered. Jack almost smiled. Linda examined Bella from a respectful distance, noting the dog's clear eyes, the puppy's movement, the clean blanket, the bowl of water. "You're doing better than you think," she said. "Mother needs food and rest. Puppies need warmth. You need sleep, though I can tell from your face you've been negotiating poorly with that concept. I've handled worse. That's what men say right before they fall over into something expensive." This time, Jack did smile, barely, and it startled him. Linda saw it but had the decency not to celebrate. She stood slowly and returned to the table. "I'll check again in a few days, or you can come down if you need more. Road's bad, but passable if you know where not to be stupid." "I'm not looking for company." Linda pulled on her gloves. "Good. I'm not offering company. I'm offering supplies. Different animal." At the door, she paused and looked back. Her bluntness softened, not into pity, but something steadier. "You know, Jack, folks down the mountain don't see smoke from this place and think nothing of it. You may have wanted to become invisible, but mountains are poor accomplices. They echo everything." He had no answer. Linda stepped onto the porch, fog curling around her like a shawl. "You're not as gone as you think," she added. Then she left, her boots thudding down the wet steps, her figure dissolving into the gray. The cabin felt oddly larger after she was gone, as if her visit had opened a window no one could see. Jack stood by the door for a long time. Bella lowered her head again, satisfied that the world had not ended. Lucky rooted blindly against her side. Daisy slept with her tiny chin tucked over her brother's back. The bread on the table cooled beside the open laptop. As evening settled, Jack cut a slice and ate it, standing up, tasting butter, salt, and something like memory. Then he sat at the table. Emma's email waited where he had left it. "Are you okay, Dad?" His fingers hovered over the keyboard. He wanted to write a great apology, something noble and complete, something that could bridge 3 years of silence in one clean sentence. But grief had made him clumsy, and love, he was discovering, did not always return with eloquence. Sometimes it came back limping, carrying dog food and warm bread. He typed slowly, "I'm here." I don't know how to be okay yet, but I'm here." He stared at the words until they seemed both too small and too honest. Then, before fear could dress itself as wisdom, he hit send. The message disappeared. Jack sat back, heart pounding like he had done something reckless. Near the fire, Bella exhaled. Lucky squeaked. Daisy stirred, but did not wake. Outside, fog pressed gently against the windows, but inside the cabin, one more door had opened. The morning arrived quietly, dressed in pale fog and thin gold light, with the Blue Ridge trees dripping from days of soft rain and the mountain breathing like a sleeping animal. Jack Miller woke in the armchair near the hearth, one hand resting on the blanket he had pulled over himself sometime after midnight. For the first time in weeks, he had slept longer than an hour without jolting awake. The laptop on the table was closed now, but the message he had sent to Emma still seemed to glow in the room like a small coal that had not gone out. "I'm here. I don't know how to be okay yet, but I'm here." He had read those words 3 times before finally shutting the screen, half expecting regret to come marching in with muddy boots. It had not. Fear had come, yes. Shame, too. But beneath them was a quieter feeling. Frightening because it was almost peaceful. Jack sat up slowly and listened, as he had learned to do every morning since Bella came through the storm. He expected Bella's steady breathing, Lucky's dramatic squeaks, Daisy's soft little sighs. Instead, the cabin answered with silence. Not the old silence, not exactly. This one was sharper, freshly made. Jack turned toward the hearth. The wool blanket lay empty, shaped faintly by the bodies that had slept there. The bowl beside it was dry. A few strands of black and tan fur clung to the edge of the cloth. For several seconds, Jack did not move. His mind refused the obvious and went searching for smaller explanations. Bella had shifted to the corner. Lucky had wriggled under the chair. Daisy was tucked behind the wood box. He rose too quickly, knocking his knee against the table, and crossed the cabin. "Bella?" His voice came out lower than he meant it to. He checked behind the armchair, beneath the old desk, beside the pantry, even inside the crate he had cleaned, though Bella had never trusted it. Nothing. The cabin was not empty, but it had been left. That was worse. Jack pulled open the door. Cool air slid in, smelling of wet moss, pine needles, and the mineral breath of mountain stone after rain. There, pressed into the soft mud beyond the porch steps, were tracks. One large set, deep and deliberate. 2 smaller trails wobbling beside it, sometimes disappearing where the pups must have been nudged or carried forward by their mother's body. The prints led toward the tree line, into the white veil of morning fog. Jack did not think. He grabbed his jacket, shoved his feet into boots, and stepped off the porch. "Bella!" The name struck the trees and came back thinner. He followed the tracks down the slope through fern and rhododendron, past the slick stones where rainwater still ran in silver threads. His old training returned, but grief had its hands on the wheel. He read the earth quickly. Bella had not been running. Her stride was steady. The puppies had stumbled, stopped, resumed. Lucky's prints veered sideways more than once, bold and foolish, while Daisy's stayed closer to Bella's path, small and careful. Jack's chest tightened at the sight of it. He could almost picture them. Lucky charging toward a leaf as if destiny had called. Daisy pausing under her mother's shadow. Bella guiding them both with patient authority. That image should have comforted him. It did not. "You should have waited," he muttered, though he knew how ridiculous that sounded. She was a dog, not a tenant with a lease agreement. Still, something inside him felt betrayed with the pure, unreasonable ache of a child waking from a good dream. He had fed them, named them, guarded the fire for them. He had let them matter. And now the blanket was empty. The trail dipped into a stand of hemlocks where fog clung low among the trunks. Jack moved slower there, boots sinking into mud, one hand occasionally bracing against wet bark. The forest was alive with small sounds, water dropping from leaves, a distant jay scolding the morning, the hidden rush of the North Creek below. yet every sound seemed to deepen the absence. He called again, softer this time. Bella, Lucky, Daisy. The names did not summon them. They only proved he had given pieces of himself away. At the edge of a narrow clearing, the tracks paused. Bella had circled once, perhaps to let the puppies rest. The mud showed where she had stood facing the cabin, then turned toward the deeper woods. Jack stared at the marks until his eyes burned. "They're not lost," a voice said behind him. Jack spun, shoulders tightening, body lowering by instinct. A man stood several yards away near a moss-covered poplar, so still that the fog seemed to have built itself around him. He looked to be in his late 60s, tall but slightly stooped, with a lean frame hardened by work rather than comfort. His face was angular and sun-browned, cut with deep lines around the eyes and mouth, and a gray beard covered his jaw in a rough, practical way that suggested mirrors were not high on his list of concerns. His hair, what showed beneath a dark wool cap, was white at the temples and cropped close. He wore a faded field jacket, patched canvas pants, and boots darkened by creek water. His eyes were a washed blue, calm but not soft, the eyes of a man who had watched hard things happen and learned not to shout at them. "Frank Walker," the man said, lifting one hand slowly to show he meant no harm. "I live north of the creek. Heard you calling." Jack straightened but did not relax. "You see them?" Frank glanced at the tracks. "Saw enough." "Which direction?" "Forward." Jack's jaw tightened. "That's not an answer." "It's the only one the ground gives." Frank stepped closer, slow enough not to challenge him, and crouched beside the prince with a small grunt. Big Dog knew what she was doing. "See here." She waited until the mud firmed, but before the day warmed. Scent holds better in damp air, and the pups won't overheat. She chose morning. Jack stared at him. "They're too young." "Young, yes, not helpless." Frank touched nothing, only pointed above the marks. She paced them, let them rest, kept them close. That's not panic, that's teaching. Jack looked toward the fog where the trail vanished. "They were safe with me." Frank nodded. "I expect they were." "Then why leave?" The question came out harsher than he intended, but Frank did not flinch. The older man stood slowly, one hand on his knee. "Because safe isn't always the same as meant to stay." He said it without ceremony, and that made it harder to dismiss. Frank Walker had the manner of a man who had worn uniforms in younger years and silence afterward. Later, Jack would learn he had served as an army medic decades ago, came home with hands that knew too well how much blood a body could lose, and lost his younger brother to a flood in these same mountains. The loss had made him neither warm nor bitter. It had made him exact. He spoke only when words had weight, and he wasted no mercy dressing truth in lace. Jack hated him for that for about 3 seconds, then realized he needed it. "I don't like losing things," Jack said. Frank's mouth moved, not quite a smile. "Nobody does. Some folks just pretend it's a preference instead of a wound." The fog thinned between them. Sunlight touched the wet branches overhead. Jack looked back at the circling prints, then at the path leading onward. His body wanted to follow, to keep going until his legs gave out, to prove that if he cared enough, nothing would leave. Frank seemed to hear that thought. "You chase her too far. You turn her choice into your fear." Jack swallowed. "She chose to come to my door. And now she's chosen to leave it." Frank's voice gentled, but only slightly. "That doesn't make the first choice false." The words landed slowly. Bella had come in the storm because she needed him. He had opened the door because something in him still knew how. Perhaps that had been the whole bargain. Not ownership, not forever. A door, a fire, a night where life got one more chance. Jack looked down and saw one tiny print beside Bella's, splayed and crooked. Lucky, probably. A few inches away was another, smaller, straighter. Daisy. He breathed out and the breath shook. What am I supposed to do with the empty space? Frank looked toward the cabin, barely visible through the trees. Keep it ready. Jack turned to him. For what? Whatever knocks next. The old man adjusted his cap and began walking back the way he had come. Animals, people, forgiveness. Usually shows up muddy and at the worst possible hour. That sounded so much like Sarah that Jack almost laughed, except the ache in his throat stopped him. Frank paused once at the edge of the clearing. You gave them shelter, Miller. Don't ruin the gift by calling it abandonment. Then he disappeared into the hemlocks as quietly as fog lifting from water. Jack remained alone among the tracks. He did not follow farther. It took him a long time to turn around, but when he did, the forest did not feel like it had stolen from him. It felt like it had received something he had been lucky enough to hold for a while. Back at the cabin, the empty blanket waited by the hearth. Jack knelt and touched the place where Bella had slept. A few hairs clung to his fingers. He folded the blanket carefully, not putting it away, not yet. He set it beside the fire, close enough to be seen, close enough to remember. Then he filled the water bowl and left it there too, though he knew how foolish it looked. The cabin was quieter now, but Jack did not close the laptop, did not shutter the windows, did not bolt the door against the world. He sat beside the hearth until the fog burned off and the mountain revealed itself in green and gold. Thank you, he said at last, to Bella, to Lucky, to Daisy, to Sarah, perhaps even to the empty space itself. The words did not bring them back. They did something better. They stayed. Nearly 7 weeks passed before the mountain reminded Jack Miller that peace was never a possession, only a guest that needed tending. Summer had thickened over the Blue Ridge slopes, turning the forest a deep, breathing green, but the rain returned with a coldness that did not belong to the season. It began before dawn as a steady tapping on the roof, then grew into a hard, slanting downpour that blurred the windows and filled the gullies with brown, rushing water. Jack stood on the porch with one hand against the rail, watching the old creek below the cabin rise inch by inch. Since Bella had left with Lucky and Daisy, he had kept moving because stillness invited too much thought. He repaired the porch steps, cleared brush from the trail, stacked wood for a winter still months away, and answered one more email from Emma with 3 sentences instead of 1. It was not healing in the grand, shining way people liked to imagine. It was smaller than that, uglier sometimes, like prying rusted nails from old boards. But it was real. The blanket Bella had used still lay folded beside the hearth, and the water bowl remained near the door, clean and empty, not because Jack expected her every morning, but because gratitude had its own strange rituals. By noon, the creek had turned violent. It roared through the hollow below the cabin, dragging branches, mud, and pale foam against the rocks. Jack knew that sound. It was not just water, it was weight looking for something weak. The wooden footbridge over the narrow gorge had been there longer than Jack had owned the cabin, a rough structure of weather-dark boards and hand-cut rails connecting his upper trail to the old service road. Hikers sometimes used it without permission. Linda Brooks used it when the lower road washed out. Frank Walker had once called it a stubborn piece of lumber pretending to be infrastructure. Jack had meant to reinforce it for weeks. Like most threats, it had waited politely until delay became dangerous. He pulled on his rain jacket, took a hammer, rope, nails, and a short stack of braces from the shed, and stepped into the storm. The trail had become slick red mud under his boots. Rain ran down the back of his neck, cold enough to make his shoulders tighten. Every tree seemed to lean under the weight of water, leaves flashing silver in the wind. When he reached the bridge, he saw the problem at once. One of the lower supports had shifted where the bank had softened, and the centerboards flexed with each surge below. Jack cursed under his breath, not dramatically, but with professional disappointment, as if the bridge had failed an inspection it had never asked to take. He tied the rope around a nearby oak, looped it around his waist, and stepped carefully onto the first plank. Old instincts guided him. Test weight. Keep low. Do not trust anything wet that looks stable. He drove the first brace into place. Then the second. The work became a rhythm. Rain, hammer, thunder, breath. For a while the rhythm held. Then one board split beneath his right boot with a crack sharp enough to cut through the storm. Jack shifted fast, reaching for the rail, but the rail came loose in his hand. His body dropped sideways. The rope caught for a fraction of a second, burning across his ribs, then the mud around the oak root gave way and the line slipped. Jack hit the rocky bank below hard, shoulder first, then hip, then leg. Pain exploded white behind his eyes. He rolled once and stopped against a half-submerged boulder while rain hammered his face. For several seconds he could not breathe. When air finally returned, it came with a groan he would have mocked in another man. He tried to stand, his right leg folded under him with a deep, sickening bolt of pain that ran from ankle to thigh. Not broken clean, maybe, but badly damaged. Bad enough. He dragged himself toward the underside of the bridge, using both elbows, teeth clenched so hard his jaw ached. Each movement sent fire through his leg. The creek climbed higher, licking at stones only feet away. His radio was back at the cabin. His phone, useless as usual in the hollow, showed no signal before the rainwater killed the screen entirely. "Brilliant work, Miller," he rasped. "Survive war, get defeated by wet carpentry." The joke was thin, but it kept panic from entering too loudly. He wedged himself beneath the angled bank where the broken bridge gave a little shelter. Rain still found him. It always did. Cold seeped through his clothes and into his bones. Time lost its edges. He counted breaths, then counted thunder, then lost count of both. As afternoon darkened into the bruised gray of evening, the pain became something vast and distant. That frightened him more than the sharpness had. Pain meant the body was still arguing. Numbness meant it had started negotiating surrender. Somewhere inside the rain, Sarah came back to him. Not as a ghost with glowing edges, not as a miracle fit for stained glass, but as memory wearing her old yellow raincoat, auburn curls damp against her cheeks, hazel eyes bright with that stubborn kindness that had once made him feel both rescued and slightly scolded. She crouched beside him in his mind as clearly as if the mountain had opened a door. "You always did hate asking for help," she said. Jack's lips twitched, though his teeth were chattering now. "I opened the door," he whispered. "I tried." "You did more than try." Her voice was gentle, but Sarah had never mistaken gentleness for weakness. "You let life matter again." Rainwater ran into his eyes. Or maybe it was not only rain. "They left." "No," Sarah said, smiling sadly. "They went on. That is not the same thing." The creek roared louder. Jack's eyelids grew heavy. He thought of Emma reading his poor, clumsy message. He thought of Linda's warm bread, Frank's hard wisdom, Bella's amber eyes in the doorway, Lucky's ridiculous little squeaks, Daisy's quiet breath. He had not become whole, but perhaps for a few weeks he had become reachable. That seemed like something worth having been. Then a bark tore through the storm. Jack's eyes opened. At first he thought the sound belonged to memory, another trick the mind played when cold began lighting candles in the dark. But it came again, sharp, fierce, and much too real. He turned his head. Through the rain, a black and tan shape moved along the bank with impossible purpose. "Bella," he breathed. She came down toward him, leaner than before, stronger, her coat soaked but glossy beneath the mud, her amber eyes bright and commanding. She was no longer the desperate mother from the porch. She moved like a queen of rain and root, scarred by survival, crowned by it. Behind her came two young dogs, larger now but still carrying puppy awkwardness in their legs. Lucky was dark-backed and reckless, his ears half raised, body all momentum and noise as he slid down the muddy slope. Daisy followed with more care, smaller than her brother, pale-marked under the chin, her gaze fixed on Jack with a calm that felt far older than her weeks. Bella reached him and pressed her body against his side, warm through the wet fabric. Jack made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob. "You came back." Bella barked once, not sentimentally, but as if correcting him. "Of course." Then she turned toward Lucky and gave a low command in the language of mothers. Lucky hesitated only long enough to sneeze rain from his nose, then scrambled back up the bank toward the trail, barking wildly as he went. Daisy stayed. She tucked herself against Jack's other side, trembling but determined, adding her small warmth to Bella's. Jack slid one shaking hand over Bella's neck. "Good girl," he whispered. "Bossy, terrifying, perfect girl." Bella ignored the praise, which was probably wise. She barked again toward the ridge, a deep, repeated alarm that cut through the rain. Jack drifted in and out after that. Sometimes he felt Bella's breathing, sometimes Daisy's small body, sometimes Sarah's imagined hand on his cheek. Then came another sound, engines, distant at first, then closer, grinding over the flooded service road. Lights moved through the trees. Human voices shouted. Lucky's bark rose above them like a tiny, furious trumpet. The rescue team appeared in flashes of yellow rain gear and headlamps. At their front was Megan Carter, a search and rescue medic in her early 30s, tall and athletic, with warm brown skin, green eyes made sharper by focus, and chestnut hair braided tightly beneath her helmet. She had a calm, practical face, the kind that did not waste fear on display, and a voice trained to make frightened people believe the next minute was survivable. Local volunteers respected her because she could read a trail in bad weather and because she never mocked panic. Not in children, not in old men, not even in stubborn former soldiers who got themselves trapped under bridges. She knelt beside Jack, rain dripping from her chin, and checked his pulse with gloved fingers. "Jack Miller, stay with me. I'm Megan Carter. Your little black and tan siren found Linda Brooks half a mile up the road and nearly took her knees out." Jack blinked. "Lucky? If that's the loud one, yes." Megan glanced at Bella and Daisy, who still refused to move far from him. "And I'm guessing these two are family." Jack looked at Bella. Her eyes held his, steady as the night she had first arrived. "Yeah," he whispered. "Something like that." Megan smiled once, quick and bright against the storm. "Good. Then, let's not disappoint them." The team worked fast, wrapping Jack in thermal blankets, stabilizing his leg, lifting him onto a rescue sled. Bella growled when one man moved too abruptly, and Megan, proving her intelligence beyond question, told him to slow down before the mother dog judged him unworthy of continued existence. Even through the pain, Jack almost laughed. As they pulled him up toward the trail, he saw Lucky circling Linda Brooks in the distance, soaked and proud, while Daisy pressed close to Bella's leg. The rain still fell, the creek still raged, but Jack no longer felt alone beneath it. The man who had opened his door to kindness in a storm had been found by that kindness when he could no longer stand. Jack Miller survived, though survival did not return him to the man he had been before the creek, the broken bridge, and the rain-soaked miracle beneath it. For 3 weeks after the rescue, the lower half of his right leg lived inside a rigid brace, and every step reminded him that the mountain had taken payment for his delay. The doctors in Asheville had called the injury serious but fortunate, which Jack found to be the sort of sentence people used when they had never tried crossing a room at 2 a.m. with a crutch, a stubborn bladder, and a floorboard that creaked like it was laughing at them. His stride changed. His balance changed. Pain followed him from bed to chair, from porch to hearth, from morning light into the long blue hours after sunset. But it was not the old pain. The old pain had been a locked room. This new pain was a bell. It rang with every careful step, reminding him that he was still here, still breathing, still being asked by the world to answer. When he returned to the cabin, Linda Brooks had left soup in the icebox. Frank Walker had stacked a week's worth of split wood by the porch, and Megan Carter had taped a note to the door that read, "Do not repair bridges alone. This is medical advice and common sense." Jack stood there on one crutch, reading it twice, then let out a laugh so rusty it startled a crow from the railing. Bella's blanket still rested beside the hearth. The water bowl still waited near the door. For the first time he did not look at those things with hunger. He looked at them with gratitude. In the weeks that followed, Jack began rebuilding not just what had broken, but what had been waiting to be useful. He repaired the bridge first, though he did it with help this time. Frank arrived with a toolbox older than some religions and a face carved into its usual expression of calm disapproval. The old veteran was thin and weathered, his gray beard rough along his jaw, his pale blue eyes sharp beneath his wool cap, and his humor dry enough to qualify as a fire hazard. He said little, but when Jack tried to lift a beam too soon, Frank looked at him and said, "You planning to heal that leg, or simply annoy it into surrender?" Jack put the beam down. Linda came to, tall and spare in her patched canvas coat, steel-gray hair tucked beneath a green cap, moving with the brisk authority of a woman who believed sympathy was best expressed through labor. She brought nails, sandwiches, and 3 opinions about the angle of the railing. By sunset, the bridge stood stronger, reinforced with new planks, steel brackets, and a handrail that would have made even Megan Carter stop glaring at it professionally. After the bridge came the cabin. Jack widened the front steps and built a ramp along the porch, not because he liked admitting weakness, but because he had learned that mercy needed practical architecture. He patched the roof properly, sealed gaps between the logs, cleared a dry corner of the shed, and turned it into a small pen lined with straw. The first animal came before he had even finished the gate. A young beagle mix left in a laundry basket by the porch, one back paw wrapped poorly in a dish towel, floppy ears too large for her narrow head, brown and white fur muddy to the ribs, and eyes full of the offended dignity of someone who had expected better transportation. Jack called her Penny because she was small, copper-colored around the ears, and clearly convinced she was worth more than anyone had paid. She chewed one of his bootlaces before noon and stole half a biscuit before dinner. Jack told her she was a criminal. Penny wagged her tail as if accepting a medal. Then came an old barn cat with a torn ear, a limping hound from the lower road, and a fox kit brought by a farmer who pretended not to care and then stood outside the shed for 10 minutes asking if it would live. Jack did not save them all. That was the hardest lesson. Some creatures arrived too late, too cold, too badly hurt, and all he could do was keep them warm until the end. But he stayed. He did not turn away. Staying, he discovered, was a form of prayer Sarah would have understood. One evening, with the sky washed clean after rain, Jack carved a sign from a slab of pine. His hands were slower now, scarred fingers stiff around the knife, but each uneven letter felt honest as it emerged from the wood. Bella's Haven. Beneath it, smaller and rougher, he carved, "For those who cannot ask." When he hung it above the front door, the cabin seemed to change its name in the bones. It was no longer a hiding place. It was a threshold. 2 days later, Emma came. Jack heard the car before he saw it, tires crunching over gravel still damp from the last storm. He stepped onto the porch, one hand on the railing, brace hidden badly under his jeans, heart behaving like an inexperienced drummer. Emma Miller stood beside a blue sedan with a backpack over one shoulder, 26 years old, tall and lean like her father, but softer in the face where Sarah had left her mark. Her dark blonde hair fell to her shoulders in loose waves, damp at the ends from the mountain air, and her blue-gray eyes were careful, guarded, and bright with feelings she had not yet decided to forgive. She wore a denim jacket over a white shirt, faded jeans, and brown boots that looked too new for the mud. For a moment, neither of them moved. Grief stood between them like an old locked gate. Then Penny escaped through the half-open shed door, galloped across the yard on 3 good legs and 1 dramatic limp, and launched herself at Emma's boots as if welcoming a visiting queen. Emma looked down, startled, then laughed. It was not a big laugh, not the kind that fixed years, but it cracked the silence cleanly in half. "You have a 3-legged greeter?" she asked. "4-legged," Jack said. "One leg just prefers management." Emma laughed again, And this time Jack heard Sarah in it so clearly that his throat tightened. They did not rush into apologies. They ate soup at the kitchen table. They spoke first of safe things: the drive, the bridge, Linda's sandwiches, Penny's crimes against shoelaces. Later, when dusk gathered at the windows, Emma touched the chipped blue mug that had belonged to Sarah and said, "I used to hate that you kept her things but wouldn't talk about her." Jack looked at his hands. "I thought silence was safer." "For who?" she asked, not cruelly. The question landed where it needed to. Jack breathed in, slow and uneven. "For me, maybe. Not for you." Emma's eyes filled, but she did not look away. "I missed you while you were still alive." There it was, the wound named plainly. Jack nodded, accepting it because denial would have been another kind of running. "I'm sorry," he said. The words were small, but this time he did not ask them to do all the work. Emma reached across the table and placed her hand over his. Her fingers were cold from washing bowls in the sink. Her grip was Sarah's, firm and forgiving only after truth had been invited in. She stayed the night. Then another. By the third morning she was helping him clean the shed, scolding Penny and reading labels on medicine bottles with the severe focus of a woman determined not to lose another parent to stubbornness. That morning, after rain had polished the world bright and every leaf shone like green glass, Bella returned. Jack felt the change before he understood it. Penny stopped chewing a rope. The old cat lifted his scarred head. Emma, standing beside the porch rail, went still. At the edge of the clearing stood Bella, lean and strong, her black and tan coat glossy in the sun, amber eyes steady as firelight remembered. Lucky stood on one side of her, bigger now, dark-backed, ears half-raised, tail moving with the reckless joy of a creature who considered restraint a personal insult. Daisy stood on the other side, smaller, pale-marked under the chin, calm and watchful, her gaze moving from Jack to Emma to the open door. Jack did not call out at first. He did not rush. The old fear rose, but it no longer ruled him. Bella stepped forward, crossed the yard, and stopped at the porch. For a long moment she looked at the sign above the door. Then she placed one paw on the first step. Lucky could not bear ceremony and bounded up immediately, nearly knocking Jack sideways before Emma caught his arm, laughing through sudden tears. Daisy followed with quiet dignity. Bella came last. Jack knelt carefully, his injured leg protesting, and rested his hand against her neck. Warm, real, returned. "Welcome home," he whispered. Bella leaned her head briefly against his chest, then turned toward the yard, toward the woods, toward the open door, choosing all of it without fear. Emma stood beside Jack, one hand steady on his shoulder. The cabin behind them smelled of pine, soup, straw, old smoke, and new life. Jack understood then that love was not a chain, and healing was not a door that closed behind pain. Love came, left, returned, changed shape, and asked only that there be room when it arrived. This time there was room. This time the door stayed open. Sometimes miracles do not arrive with thunder from heaven or light breaking across the sky. Sometimes God sends them quietly, through a tired dog at the door, a wounded heart that still chooses kindness, a daughter brave enough to return, or a second chance hidden inside an ordinary morning after rain. Jack learned that love is not always something we can keep by holding tightly. Sometimes love teaches us to open the door, let go with faith, and trust that what is meant to return will find its way home. In our daily lives we may all face storms no one else can see: grief, loneliness, regret, fear. But God often places small miracles along our path to remind us that we are not forgotten. A neighbor who checks in, a child who forgives, an animal that needs our help, a simple act of mercy that slowly brings us back to life. So, when kindness knocks, may we never let fear answer first. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who may need a little hope today. Leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from, or share a miracle you have witnessed in your own life. Subscribe to the channel for more heartfelt stories of faith, love, animals, and second chances. May God bless you, protect your family, heal every quiet wound in your heart, and keep your door open to hope.